All right, the first one is based on our paper, Reflections on Dynamics, Adaptations, and Control, a cognitive architecture for mental models. And this is written by myself and Jan Treur. So I'll quickly go over what we are discussing. So first of all, the concept of mental models as relational structures in our mind. So how to use them, how to adapt them, and how to control them as well. Then I will introduce, based on the mental models, I will introduce an overall cognitive architecture for mental models. So again, how you can use, adapt, and control these. And finally, I will just give some applications on how and where this can be used. So first of all, mental models in our head, using and learning them. I guess every single one of us will use them in some shape or form, whether you know about it or not. So Craig explains this really nicely as follows. If an organism carries a small-scale model of external reality and of its own possible actions within its head, it's able to try out. So the trying out will be some kind of internal simulation. So he will be able to try out various alternatives, conclude which is the best of them, react to future situations before they arise. So the reacting is like the decision making, and then utilize the knowledge of past events in dealing with the present and future. In other words, learning it, and in every way to react in a much fuller, safer, and more competent manner to the emergencies which face it. So pretty important stuff. And this is kind of continuing on the previous, again by Craig. So by relation structure, I do not mean some obscure non-physical entity which attends the model, but the fact that it is a physical working model which works in the same way as the process it parallels. Thus, the model need not resemble the real object pictorially, so like literally, but it works in the same way in certain essential respects. So the picture below kind of shows that a little bit better. We have a real world situation, which is like in the blue blob, and between world states W and W accent, there's a kind of relation. And then in the mental model, there is states that are similar, but not necessarily the same. And they also have a relationship between them. So what's important is that they both have the relation between the states that are resembling each other. So we can distinguish between a few different types of mental models. First of all, we have states versus processes. So the process is something that is a bit more dynamic, and state is something a bit more just a state in the world. And in each of them, we have a world and a mental process and a world and mental state. So we have a bunch of examples here. I'll just take a few out, but because of time, I won't go over all of them. So for example, in the top part, as I said, process descriptions are a bit more dynamic. So for example, a mental process in the more dynamic part would be a mental model of how your partner will get angry or disappointed after you do a specific action. Or in the state description, which was more like the static one, again, let's say the mental one is a mental model of belief someone else has on the world. So even though someone's beliefs can change, your specific mental model of someone's state at a specific time is more static. So these are like 4 categories that you can kind of put all of these in. So let's continue about, so we now kind of know what different kind of mental models are. And now I will discuss how this works in educational science and anything related to learning these kind of mental models. So there is a lot of literature on mental models in educational science, although they're not necessarily always called mental models. For example, with Piaget, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, and Maybe some of you already have heard of this person. He was super important in educational learning research, and he spoke actually a lot about concepts that we can literally translate to mental models, even though he never really called it that way. So Piaget, he distinguishes between two types of mental models, I'll just call them. So the first one is assimilation. So it's kind of refining your mental model. So for example, I need something, so I need to go to a shopping area. And then assimilation of this model or refinement would be needing a book means that you need something. Needing something means to go to a shopping area. And then the combination of those two is needing a book and I am in a shopping area. I'm looking for a bookshop. So this assimilation means that the previous relations are still true, but you're kind of adding onto it to refine it. And then we have accommodation. So that is more like revising your existing mental model. So for example, during the pandemic, we can't really go to a shop in a shopping area. So it would change to I need something and I go to a web shop. We have different ways of learning in our mental models. So it can be either by observation or by instruction. And we can exert control for learning about these mental models based on metacognition. So we have a few examples. So there is instructor-controlled instructional learning. So that will be the instructor saying exactly how you're supposed to learn something. Then there is learner-controlled instructional learning, which would be like the student itself decides what's the best way to learn something. So for example, some students in a class find it easier to understand something visually or by audio, by hearing it and stuff like that. And integrated observational and instructional learning. So that's kind of like a combination. So the student will first, for example, try to learn something themselves, and after the instructor will come and do it their way, and they're kind of like combining that, or the other way around. So now we are all into the mental models and how to learn them. We want to, I see someone chatted something. Oh, I'll get back to that later. So we have an overall cognitive architecture for mental models that we're going to use for later on. So there is a few levels. We have the use of a mental model, which is the previously also discussed internal simulation. If you remember that quote I read in the beginning. Then we have adaptation of a mental model, so learning and forgetting. And finally, we have control of the learning and the forgetting and the model itself. So in other terms, the mental model is normally like a kind of relational structure with states and relations in it. The second level or first order level is adapting the relations. I will go more into this in my next presentation. And finally, we have control over these relations. So these are like the three levels, and that's an overall architecture that you can use to formalize these mental models. Then we have a few works that we used this in already. So these are kind of a few examples that we have used the cognitive architecture for. So first of all, using metaphors as mental models for joint decision making. This also happens to be my next presentation. Flashback movies in PTSD as learned mental models. How a mental God model affects your behavior. Controlled learning of mental models for car driving. So all of these topics seem to be very different, but they're all using this architecture to formalize and simulate these mental models. And learning from counterfactual thinking based on mental models. All of these papers can also be found in the book that is at the bottom in yellow, written by Jan Treur and myself. So if you're interested, have a look. And then we have design and simulation of network models by modeling based on drawing pictures and writing tables, no programming, meaning that in this architecture, you can kind of just use the architecture to really get to the modeling instead of trying to understand all the formulas behind it. And there even is a dedicated software environment that you can freely download. So you just make the model, play around with it, and put it into the software environment in MATLAB, and then you can run your simulations. Okay, so I kept this one a bit short because my next will be a bit longer. So if there's any questions so far.